So I did come into parent education in a rather unique way compared to my colleagues. I'm the third generation in my family to be a parent educator. So when I was a kid growing up, my parents would hold parent study classes in my living room. And all the parents would study with books and I would be the babysitter. And I honestly didn't really know what was going on at the time. I thought it was just like a book club or whatever. So I went through school to get a degree in science. My actual training is in science. And I was working actually in nonprofits. But then I became a mother. And when you become a mother, you think, well, it's everything. Yes, and suddenly I did okay in the beginning. I could get my kids to sleep, and that was fine. But then they started to misbehave. And I thought, well, what did my parents do? They had this parent study group. They knew how to raise me. How come I don't know how to raise my own children? How come I can't rely on intuition? Why can't I rely on my memories? So I went back and read the book my parents taught out of, which was Children the Challenge by Rudolf Dreikurs. And that book opened my eyes to all the parenting philosophy and things about child behavior that unless you were told, you would have no way of knowing any of this. It's not intuitive. And from that moment, I said, I have to tell everybody who has a baby. I have to tell every person who has a child. You don't know what you don't know. You have to know this. And I changed my entire life and my career to continue to study and learn myself, and then to turn around and help my fellow mothers and fathers. And so when it came to writing a book, I was actually approached by a publishing company who said, we follow your blog, we go to your talks, you need to write a book and get it out to more people. And here I am this many years later with 3 books and internationally published in about 5 languages. And I really feel like I'm helping people around the world. I'm just thrilled. This is a very important distinction, and it's a point of confusion with parents. So praise is language that we use for children that is basically a verbal reward. So just the same way you might reward a child by, if you have good grades, I will give you money, or if you act a certain way, I'll put a tick on a tick box and you'll earn privileges. We're used to these types of rewards, but this is just a verbal reward that's very innocent. It may just be something like if a child hangs up their coat and you say, good boy. That doesn't sound like you're rewarding them per se, but the definition is that you're evaluating their behavior, you're deeming it to meet your external criteria, and that you're somehow validating them in a way that makes them feel that their worth is tied to their performance. And so encouragement is different. Encouragement is not about judgment, and it is not about an external validation or criteria. Encouragement sends the message of courage. Encouragement. It is the courage to be an imperfect, incomplete person. So it says you're learning how to hang up your coat, you're learning how to tell time, you're learning how to tie up your shoe. And just because you may not know everything or be perfect yet, your value as a human being is still completely intact, which means if you make a mistake or you're not an A student in every subject matter, you're not less of a human being. And it's very different messages the child gets about their worth as a human being. Our cultural tradition is to raise children who will be obedient to our will, listen to our commands and obey us. And the methodologies that we have used in order to keep people under our control has been to punish them if they don't and to reward them if they do. And that's so entrenched in how we organize societies, in how we organize families, our smallest social unit, that most of us are very comfortable in and familiar with those methods. And we come from a belief that a child would never obey or a child would never behave properly if we didn't. That we think if we didn't use these methods, we would have chaos and that our children would take over the family. And this is not true. This is not true. These are methods of gaining obedience, which is one model. But instead, we're actually wired as a species to be cooperative. We're social creatures, just like cows in a herd, bees in a hive, ants in a colony. We are humans in a family, and we're wired to get along. So the way that I talk to parents is about how to raise cooperative children rather than obedient children. And that means a child that will hang up their coat and come to the table when called and dress appropriately and do their homework, not because they're afraid of you and not because they're going to get a reward for it, but because they know it's the right thing to do. There's actually motivation inside the child rather than external motivation. And many people don't believe children could act this way, but they can. Spanking is a word we only use for children, isn't it true? We don't spank our wives or spank our servants. Why do we call it spanking? We're trying to pretty up the language around what we're really doing, which is striking another human being. And we've seen that over the course of time, using physical force and hurting another human being's body, we have a human rights movement that says just because you're married to your wife, she's not your chattel, she's not your possession. You cannot strike her to make her stay in line. You know, this is not how it works. And I would say the same needs to extend to children. If you're not allowed to strike a coworker to make them work harder, or you can't strike your wife so that she will listen to you, neither should we strike a child because they won't pick up their toys. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't use a discipline tactic in order to address a child who's not being cooperative. We should. But spanking leads to fear. It ruins the primary attachment between the parent and child. And when children are frightened of their parents, they're actually in the worst position to be a learner. And so we're less likely to guide them towards more constructive behavior when we strike them. There's so many strategies that people are unaware of. This is why we need to pick up a book or take a class or learn about these things. Because if we're not going to use punishment and spanking, what will we do instead? If we just simply ask nicely, clean up your toys, they'll say no. And in our frustration, we'll go back to spanking because we haven't replaced the techniques. The new techniques need to be taught. So there's many. I carry in my workshops a toolbox, and I open the toolbox and I have images of all the different tools. There's 30 or 40 different ways that we can approach a child's misbehavior to replace yelling and spanking. But they must be taught. In one 500-word blog post, I can give a parent a new idea of what to do and say differently that they will then go home and try, and they'll get the right reaction from the child, and they'll say, hallelujah! All I had to do was say this instead of that, and suddenly I'm getting their cooperation. It's a miracle. And so in one way, it can be extremely fast. But in another way, it can really take time because we really are talking about a revolution in the family, a change in belief systems and a change in our attitudes about children and how much they're capable of and how to think about models of respect flowing in two directions instead of just one. And so in some ways, I would say you might have to take, a 6-week parenting class or read an entire 300-page book, and you may need more to have the full change. That's probably a very popular blog post because it sounds like, how crazy is this woman? How can you not make your child say, I'm sorry? But what I'm really trying to do is the same thing that all parents want, which is I want a child to know that the social protocol when you hurt someone or you act badly is to apologize. And the question is not in trying to accomplish that goal, but it's about the method in order to really get there. So typically when a parent forces a child to say, I'm sorry, the child perceives that as humiliating them. I made a mistake and now you're outing me. You're drawing attention to my mistake. And rather than feeling empathy for the person that they have wronged, they feel embarrassed and mad. And so they'll end up obliging their parents and they'll say, "I'm sorry." But they don't really feel the genuine empathy. So instead, if we step back a little bit and leave space and tell the child not to say, "I'm sorry," which is do as I say, which they'll rebel, and instead ask them to make a promise about the future. What could you do to make this child feel better? What can you promise you won't take their toy again or bite them again? And if they make a promise for the future, they're more likely to actually fulfill that promise. And then just with time and repetition, they hear that other people say, "I'm sorry." It will come genuinely without you forcing it. If you force it, they're more likely to not want to do it. One wish on this magic wand. It's not the genie pot where I get 3. That's a hard one. I think truly my mission is to help parents understand that taking parent education should be considered an act of being a responsible parent, and that it should be normalized the same way that we see prenatal education or medical preparation for a child. There's a stigma to getting educated in parenting that makes people feel that I must be doing it wrong, my child must be bad, why do I need help? And so my wish is to remove the stigma of parent education. That's probably my biggest desire. That children misbehave for a reason, and that the reason is valid. And if we understood things through the eyes of the child and understand that they have a mistaken approach at trying to get their needs met, it would improve parents' empathy, and they would realize, they're not doing this because they're bad or they're being disrespectful. They're doing this because it's a child who's creatively trying to solve a problem. And that reframes the entire thing. And it tells you what you need to do differently once you understand the child.